the second half of section 1 of criminology, and we're going to talk about measures of crime, i.e., how do we know how much crime is actually happening? Okay? There are two major ways to tell how much crime is happening in the United States. The first and oldest is the Uniform Crime Report. It's been gathered by the FBI since like the 30s. Okay? And it started off with only 8 crimes. I can't remember all 8, but it was murder, auto theft, arson, a few others. But it was all 8 were fairly major crimes like that. And they started tracking it. And it's gotten a little more complicated, over time, to where today there's far more than 8 crimes tracked by the UCR. But they gather data from individual police departments around the country, and then they kind of compile all this data from all these departments all over the country, and put it all together, and release it, usually the next year, right? So as I'm recording this is 2020. The data for 2019, I believe, was recently released, or maybe still coming up, but it's all publicly available. You can find it. If you just do a Google search for Uniform Crime Report FBI data. The problem with this, though, the big problem with UCR data is that it only tracks crimes reported to the police. So if a crime happens, but the police never hear about it, it's not reflected in that UCR data. Now, there's probably very, very few, say, murders that aren't reported to the police. Either all murders or really, really close to all murders are gonna get reported to the police at some point, right? But other crimes, maybe not so much, right? There are a lot of people who are a victim of fraud and are embarrassed about being a victim, and so they just never report it. They just write the loss in money off and, go about their business. So in the, I think it was the 60s or the 70s, a group started up the National Crime Victimization Survey. So now we're not looking at crimes per se, we're looking at victims, right? And what the NCVS does is it interviews households, right? They have a random sample of households from all over the country, and they interview these households every 6 months for the course of 2.5 years. If you're selected to be in their sample, you'll be in there for 2.5 years, and they'll interview you every 6 months about, in the last 6 months, have you, has your car been stolen? Has your house been broken into? They'll ask you all these questions, and then that is a much more accurate, in a lot of ways, measure of how much crime is occurring. Now, they only use a sample, whereas the UCR tries to get at every police department in the country to get actual, real, solid numbers. The NCVS is only a sample, so they can only say, statistical probability, like we think about this number of auto thefts have happened, because if our sample is a good one, we can extrapolate out from the sample to the whole country, but not necessarily talk about exact numbers, right? So, there are other surveys of how much crime is occurring, but it's usually very localized. The UCR and the NCVS are the only two that really do a good job, attempt to get the entire country, and do a decent enough job at it that we think their numbers are pretty accurate. Other surveys, if they're going to be good quality surveys or good quality data collection, they're going to be at a much more localized level, right? So it might talk about all the crime that's happening in one city or in one county. A really, really ambitious one might be like an entire state. But it's going to be really difficult to look at measures of crime in the entire country. So it's usually left up to one of those two, the UCR or the NCVS. Now, think about how, if you're an American, right, and this section of this course is very focused on the United States, and I apologize if you're not in the United States and you're viewing this, but if you're in the United States, think about how do you think crime overall has changed over the course of your life? Is crime higher now than it was 10 or 20 years ago, or 30 or 40 years ago? Is it lower now? Is it about the same, right? Is it what kind of relationship or what kind of pattern has crime taken over the course of the past 20, 30, 40, 50 years? Okay? Well, here's the reality. Crime has been plummeting for the past 20 plus years. Okay? So as you can see from this graph, property crime peaked in the early 80s, violent crime peaked in the mid 90s, and both have been going down, 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 down ever since. And I realize the last 2 or 3 years aren't on here, but they don't show a significant rise in either of these two. So crime is really at a place, at a very, very low level, lower than it's been in a long, long, long time. But at the same time, what's really interesting is, I didn't put this graph on this PowerPoint slide, but if I were to graph fear of crime has been going up, 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 right? It just since, say, roughly 2000, 2001, fear of crime has been going up while actual crime has been going down. And most researchers put the kind of blame for that on the media, right? The media is kind of driving this fear of crime that really is not reflected in reality, okay? So, by geography, think about the entire country, okay? We know for a fact that crime is higher where people are clustered together in smaller spaces, right? So urban areas have far more crime than rural or suburban areas. But think about, abstract that a little bit, right? So instead of, say, crime happens in cities and, far less crime in rural and suburban areas, think about by state, right? Because every state has urban areas, rural areas, and suburban areas, right? So think about by state. What states do you think have the highest crime versus the lowest crime? Okay? Here's the reality. And now again, this is a couple of years old, but it's not that far off from the most recent years of crime data. And this is specifically violent crimes. The pattern is going to be roughly similar with property crimes, but this is kind of close, right? And kind of generally what we see is crime is really bad kind of in the Sun Belt, right? If you have really, really high summer temperatures, you have a lot of crime for some reason, right? And we can talk all about kind of politics and geography and the environment and all these things. But in general, crime is a lot lower the further north you go. Okay? Now, time of day and seasons of the year. Okay? When does crime peak and then obviously go down? Over the course of a day, right? And then over the course of a year, right? So think about that for just a second. What time of day has the most crimes? What weeks or months of the year have the most crimes? Well, here's the truth for time of day. Now, I don't remember exactly where I got this graph, but it was particular to some city. So over the entire nation might be slightly different, but the important thing here is the shape of the graph. The shape, the rough layout is going to be the same no matter where you're talking about. So even though this data is specific to one local area, the overall message here is going to be the same anywhere. And that is basically for people over 18, which is the vast majority of us, crime peaks right about midnight, 2 a.m., right? And then plummets as even people who stay up late go to bed, right? I stay up pretty late. I think I stay up pretty late. And I'm usually in bed by 2 or 3 a.m., right? Even on my latest days. For people under 18, crime peaks a little bit earlier in the day, right? There's a big peak around 3, 4 p.m. because that's when people are getting out of school, right? If you're under 18, you're probably in school. So, they're in school all day, and then it peaks when they get out of school, but then they're usually dropping off from their criminogenic tendencies earlier than the adults are, because they go to bed earlier, their parents require them to be home earlier, etc., etc. And then here's the seasons Again, this data is for some location specifically, but again, the shape of the graph, these numbers on the left might be different for different areas of the country, or even areas of the world, but everywhere is going to have the same basic shape, where kind of warmer weather results in more crime, and as things get colder, as people stay inside more, we have less crime. Okay. Now, age. This one is one of the most explored and replicated measures in criminal justice. Okay, at what ages do people commit the most crime? Well, again, the shape here is what's important, and what we see time after time after time after time is that crime peaks in your late teens, right? Your odds of being a criminal are highest when you're, say, 16 through 20 than at any other point in your life. And the more you age, the older you get, the less and less and less and less you're going to commit crime. Okay? Now, the size, the amplitude of this graph changes with both time and place, but the overall shape of it does not. It's basically universal everywhere we've looked. Okay, and one of the things is it's changed a lot over time, right? So in the mid 90s, the peak would have been, say, way up here, right, and then coming down. But then as over time, this peak right here has come down, 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 down to where it's much lower today than it used to be, but it's still this exact same shape. Whether it increases or decreases, it stays that same peak in the late teens and then down for the rest of your life. Okay? Now, gender. Men have always committed more crime than women in every society throughout history. There are some crimes that are an exception. There are a few crimes where women commit as much as men, or even in some cases slightly more, such as shoplifting. Shoplifting, women actually commit more than men. But the vast majority of crime, very, very male-driven. But that changes over time. So, this is only through 2003. But what we can see is that over the past, many decades, the difference between the amount of crime that men and women commit has been getting smaller, right? So today, the difference between male crime and female crime is much, much, much smaller than it was, say, in the 90s, or much smaller than it was earlier than that, okay? Now, race. This is a tough one to talk about because, especially in the United States, race is so statistically tied up with things like economic opportunity, geographic location. So many measures are very statistically tied together with race and crime because of kind of the systematic way that the United States has mistreated racial minorities. The hundreds of years of, obviously first overt systemic racism, and today a little more, a little less overt, but still incredibly impactful systematic racism has caused these correlates of crime to be much, much, much more common in minority areas than it is in predominantly white areas, right? So, homicide rates for African Americans are much higher than they are for whites. Robbery rates, much higher than they are for whites. But again, over time, we're seeing this decrease in crime for everyone, right? But when we look at race and crime, one thing we notice is that a huge, huge, huge percentage of crime is intra-racial, i.e., victim and offender look very much like each other. it's very rare for victim and offender to be of two different races. So victim statistics look very much like offender statistics in regards to race. Interestingly, the highest offense rates and victimization rates are not African Americans, it's actually Native Americans. Native Americans are at the top of the offender and victim lists because, again, they've had to face this very systematic discrimination for hundreds of years, continuing into today, and that causes one of the effects of that is a very large increase in racial disparities in crime, both offending and victims. So it's Native Americans, then African Americans, then Hispanics, Caucasians, and then at the bottom is actually Asian, Pacific Islander, that racial group. But I am going to say straight out that this is not due to any inherent aspect of anybody of any race. This is a result of the kind of sociological factors, the result of environmental factors, the result of the history of race in the United States causing these disparate outcomes. There's no scientific evidence at all that is anything inherent in any given, how much melanin you have in your skin, if that makes sense. So, that's the end of section 1. I will see you for section 2.